All right, this is such an obedient crowd. Thank you so much for coming back for the closing plenary. It's really, I think, been an amazing set of sessions and a chance to hear from all of you. So we're going to hear back first from the breakout groups, and we've asked them to consolidate all your wisdom into 3 things: challenges, opportunities, and recreation recommendations for the way forward to achieve, maybe it'll be fun, to achieve Target 18. And so we're going to do those 2 groups first, and then that'll be followed by a last high-level plenary to provide some more context on where we go from here, based both on the findings of these groups, but also as well as other efforts that our distinguished panel know about around the world. And then, following that, we'll have a summary of the day by Eileen Lee, the Chief of Programs at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and a reflection, conversation, benediction between Eileen and the CEO of the Jeff. So let's start first with the report back from the breakout group sessions. And I'm going to ask Lina Barrera, who you have seen before, the Senior Vice President for Global Policy and Government Affairs at CI, to come and present the findings across the implementation breakout groups from theory to action, incentive reform. No, you're going to do agriculture and fisheries, right? Okay, so Lina will do that, and then we will turn to incentives. So first, Lina.
All right, hi everybody. First, I just want to say thank you to all of the panelists. Any of you who are in the room, please raise your hands. The moderators. We had a lot of people behind the scenes as well. If you were there, please raise your hands. We had really a huge effort that went into this. So thank you all very much. We are going to go through all of these. As Rosina said, an incredible amount of wisdom. So very quickly, we used Mentimeter, so we came out with some great graphics like this. So if you look at, who's going to win if we do subsidy reform, nobody thought that it was sort of primarily any one group, right? But ultimately, everybody wins. And I think that's a great place to be starting from, a great lens, because there are challenges. So the biggest challenge we identified is the trade-offs, right? Valerie Hickey did an excellent job of talking about that this morning. And so our recommendation coming out of that is it's really essential to understand the social benefit of whatever subsidy we're talking about and how it can be maintained while adjusting for environmental outcomes, right? So really looking at how are you going to get that just transition, understanding who's going to win or lose, and making sure that you're tailoring solutions to the specific context. The biggest opportunity we see, which counters that big challenge, is working in coalitions, right? So this really needs to be a whole of society approach, right? We need to be building coalitions that are based on trust, that have a lot of communication support and technical partners. So we put a lot in here of the types of people that need to be involved, right? Different ministries, different types of stakeholders, IPLCs, small farmers, a lot of capacity building needed often for those groups, and then really looking at the sort of technical experts. At the same time, we said it's not just the whole of society, that's kind of the process, but there also needs to be this landscape approach where you're looking at, with that whole of society, what is that end vision that you want for the whole space, right? And then really looking at how you align the policy and incentives according to that vision. All right, so here's another one of our Mentimeters. This is when you're talking about coalitions, we ask people who needs to be involved. So you'll really see, a lot here, including Taylor Swift. So, plenty of room for creativity. Then we went into sort of some crucial elements that really need to be considered, right? So in terms of making the case, right, our recommendation is, given the complexities, you really need to have excellent data, deep data on what are the impacts in both environmental and economic, who are the beneficiaries, and then you have to be able to communicate that very, very well. And that information needs to be openly accessible, right? You need a lot of sort of thorough work, and then you need to be able to communicate it and have that accessible so that you can really get beneficiary buy-in and help overcome resistance. And then we need to be using what we have, right? There's a whole toolkit, right? This was discussed in several of the sessions. There are lots of different approaches. And we're not starting from scratch. There are a lot of existing policies and tools and methodologies that have already been tested. You can see there at the bottom, we actually put some of these in because we had some great examples that came out, right? So lots of different kinds of things, from taxes to credit system to extension services, price signals, all of that. So we need to be using all the information and experience we already have. And then finally, the political timing of any effort for subsidy reform or incentive reform is essential, right? So you really need to be able to prepare the ground and then be ready to act at key moments, right? So sometimes just before an administration transitions is a good moment. Sometimes it's a terrible moment, right? Sometimes when a new administration comes in, that's a great moment. Sometimes there's something you can't predict that opens a policy window that makes it a great moment. So, you know, there's really, you need to be looking at and understanding all of those opportunities. And finally, one of the moments that we all mentioned right now is that countries are developing their national biodiversity strategies and action plans, and that is a great opportunity to start the conversation in any country about subsidy reform and how that's going to help achieve the global biodiversity framework. And we'll leave you with this final word cloud. This was the focus on, you know, what are the elements that we need to be keeping in mind for any subsidy reform effort. So you see a lot here. There's the winners and losers. How do you do a just transition? What are the intended consequences? Because sometimes there are a lot of unintended consequences, even when you're trying to fix a problem, right? Who are the stakeholders? How do you co-design? And a lot around vision and transparency. Thank you so much.
That was quite amazing, Lena. I wasn't sure how the session I was in was going to turn into such a clear and succinct conclusion, but that's really good, and I'll bet there'll be some similarities. So now we'll turn to Akansha Khatri, who is the head of Nature and Biodiversity at the World Economic Forum, and she's going to present the combined findings of the finance breakout groups, transition financing, and early movers. So over to you.
Thank you. First of all, I do want to get behind if you can get Taylor Swift to be involved in this agenda. I think we will have policy coherence finally. So yeah, lots of cheers there. I think we had really interesting discussions when we were talking about both transition finance and incentives. And I do want to say, I think in my previous comments before you all went into breakouts, I did say we need to move from risks to investment. And I was also then reminded that if you want central banks and banks on the table, they will walk into the room with the risk perspective, and that's absolutely fine, because we can then move beyond risk to opportunities. So nature risk is the prerequisite, which will bring interest from all financial institutions, but then that gives them the incentive to put money at scale. The second point that we discovered is that incentives are very important in this space. So whether they come from governments, MDBs, or other investors through the cost of capital, that is the key to accelerating the journey to achieve the target 18. And so there were lots of examples which were discussed, particularly on where the market-making mechanisms, incentives, can actually play a role. The third point that we discussed, and which has really been a big theme for COP16 as well, how do you find the mechanisms for wealth transfer to happen from the global north to the global south, particularly since there is so much of the global savings in the global north, and that's where, frankly, a lot of the financial products do get designed. So we need more of that activity to be directed towards the thinking on target 18. Lastly, we were very lucky to have Eileen also just bringing that perspective in from philanthropy, because we often get caught with the situation where for commercial banks, it's very difficult to engage in this space because either the ticket size is not right, there's replicability of that transaction is not there. So the philanthropy actually has a critical role to play by providing the catalytic capital, taking the risk where there is no one else to underwrite the risk, just so we can show this can be done. And once we have that proof point, we can move forward. But again, we were very hopeful in the groups, but there are also challenges. Unsurprisingly, data was put forward as a big challenge. The second was that there are lots of competing demands on banks right now. They're expected to act on and speak the language of climate, of nature, of justice, of desertification. So there is also, frankly, a capacity issue, and that's a human capacity issue that banks and others need to invest in with their human capital. And then the general sentiment that all of us had is, let's not wait for the perfect, but let's just get going. I think that's what is most important, is how do we come together? And even in the previous discussions, we were talking a lot about collaboration, be it with celebrities or with public-private, but really like having collaboration so we can hit the ground running and not wait for the perfect. So as you know that there were two rooms over there, so this is just a quick recommendations on where can private sector provide the leadership on these pieces. Firstly, NBSAPs should be aligned with business and subsidy reforms. Oftentimes when we are having one track of governments talking about NBSAPs and the other track of businesses talking, they are each creating some sort of a goal, target, recommendation, but frankly never talking to each other. So trying to reach the same summit of the mountain, but carving your own different paths is a waste of time. The second is we need to involve farmers and businesses to work together. So when we are talking about repurposing subsidies, ensure that farmers are not the enemy. And in most of these conversations, language matters. So how do we actually problem solve with the stakeholder that has the most to both gain from and lose from the subsidies repurposing? The third one is also a challenge on awareness. I think recognizing, and I have to admit the last few days at the COP, I've had multiple discussions on the need for both sectoral pathways, but also moving to value chains. So how do we create more awareness around how the subsidies impact at different sets of value chains? I think we were speaking earlier also about, I think you gave a very good example of just a bar of chocolate, right? So it is touching the farmer on the ground. There is somebody who's doing the machines and then somebody who's marketing it. So recognize where the subsidies are actually going. And then the other piece was really looking at subsidies and innovation and how do we really think about a new business model so that we are not just maintaining the status quo and doing like marginal improvements here and there. Minister Mohammed earlier actually in the opening plenary of the Business and Biodiversity Forum said, how do we reimagine business itself? So it's not about just transitioning from one to the other, but rethinking our whole relationship with nature. The other point that came up into the track too was also about value, not volume. And I think most people in this room would agree that let's not only chase numbers. Yes, we do want to get to that point of billions and trillions, but sometimes maybe the need is just a couple of millions on the ground. So how do we use technology? How do we use innovation to meet the need of the project rather than just chasing a number because it just sounds good? And then the last piece, which also has been a big theme at COP16, is how can repurposing subsidies fundamentally change the business and economic model, which today is heavily dependent on petrochemicals and fossil fuel, towards one which is bio-based, regenerative, and renewable. And we've had lots of innovators and businesses who've been here in Cali, Colombia, who are rethinking feedstocks to be bio-based, who are rethinking nature as an input without necessarily creating more pollution as an output. So I think it gave me a lot of hope and excitement, but I felt I learned so much from all the people in this room, is we believe it can be done if we have the right incentives in place. Businesses are willing and ready to work with policymaker, and philanthropy is coming in to be able to do the catalytic capital piece to show what is possible. So I hope that covers everything from the two tracks that we had.
That was also amazing, Akansha. I mean, obviously there's some similarities across the two, and Eileen will summarize that later. But I think one of the messages from both of you is, don't wait for the perfect. We have a lot of momentum, we have a lot of interest, we have a lot of collaborative efforts underway, and there's a lot we can do right now with that which we have even as we figure out some of the longer term things, but it can't be very long term. Well, thank you so much for that. I know there's so much more that the note takers will share eventually, but I want to thank them again for this amazing distillation of so much thought and energy and expertise, and to the rapporteurs and to all the participants in the breakout groups for really, really rich discussions and some recommendations that we will continue to think about, not only today, but going forward. So now, with those firmly in mind, we're going to move to our last high-level panel, and I'm going to invite the participants to come to the stage as I introduce them as they walk up. So first, let me introduce Ms. Maria Neto, the Executive Director of the Instituto Clima and Sociedade in Brazil. And Maria's had a really very distinguished career. It's focused mainly on climate finance, private sector engagement, and developing innovative market mechanisms for global environmental outcomes. Let me now introduce Dr. Christian Samper, who is the Managing Director at the Bezos Earth Fund, and he comes to us from Colombia, where he studied at the Universidad de los Andes. Dr. Samper has occupied many important posts in the not-for-profit world, most notably as the CEO and the President of the Wildlife Conservation Society. We're also honored to have Dr. Jacob Granit, who is the Director General of the Swedish International Development Agency, or SIDA. And Dr. Granit has worked on all aspects of the environment. I know him especially from his water work, and he even served on the scientific and technical advisory panel with me at the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, in his former life. And last but not least, by any means, let me introduce Mr. Jose Salazar, who is the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. And Mr. Salazar brings deep expertise on economic policy reform, having been the Minister of Foreign Trade in Costa Rica, among many other positions. So welcome the panel. So, dear panel, you have heard there are many recommendations that this distinguished audience thinks can advance the transformation of this incentive landscape, if you will, towards a nature positive as well as a climate positive one. And so, as I ask you questions, feel free to reflect on the summaries we just heard. But again, we will try to see if we can answer each question in 2 to 3 minutes, so I can ask you each a couple, and then we can come back together and share some thoughts if we're very disciplined. So we'll see how that works. So I thought I would start with Ms. Maria Neto, because the G20 has historically looked at economic development as a means of national progress, but more recently, the G20, and in particular under the President of Brazil, has been looking to climate and nature financing as very important measures to address development with a focus on a healthy environment. So how is Brazil approaching the alignment of its policies to do both better climate response and better nature outcomes? Maria, thank you.
Oh, okay. Wow, thank you. Brazil has a huge opportunity with nature-based solutions, both for climate as for biodiversity. Brazil has the largest potential in the world for providing, for example, restoration and being part of the huge need that the IPCC in climate change says it has to happen for removing greenhouse gases and reducing greenhouse gases, right? So in terms of opportunity, both conservation and restoration is a huge opportunity, and Brazil has a comparative advantage there. From the biodiversity side as well, it has a huge opportunity to be part of the solution and not only preserve, but also restore, doing that ecologically. At the same time, Brazil, as we were discussing before, our economies are even 100% dependent on nature, but Brazil is really dependent economically on nature because it's an agriculture country. Our energy depends largely on nature and also our fuels. And recently, we had a couple of major disasters in Brazil given to climate change, including a huge flood this year and dry seasons with fires. Those impacts had an important economic impact already in Brazil. We're having inflation, a mini inflation in Brazil because of the cost of food, fuel, and energy. So I think the linkage for the government of Brazil on nature and climate is really an economic issue for the country and is part of the development of the country as well. And we are seeing a couple of initiatives. You mentioned the G20, I think was a great opportunity for Brazil as being a leader in terms of the discussions there, in, for example, tabling for the first time bioeconomy within an initiative. And it's a great result that we had the 10 principles of bioeconomy approved in the G20 that have some important things within it, including the need to rethink of production and consumption, the key role that we have for traditional cultures as well on this, considering bioeconomy from the spectrum of science to the traditional cultural knowledge, but also keeping justice and equity at the core of it as well. Coming back to this economic argument as well. And there are a couple of initiatives happening locally that are promoting, for example, a bioeconomy plan. We have our economical plan. It's not an energy transition, it's ecological transformation plan. And I think it embraces already this notion that we need to look at different sectors and we need to look at nature and climate combined. So these are positive things, I would say, in terms of combining it. And it is resulting in a couple of specific plans that are bringing this kind of linkage of, you know, the economy with nature and climate.
Well, that's wonderful to hear that in your country, the dual goals of environment and climate just seem so naturally connected because of the economy of Brazil. But then, how does Brazil actually reconcile the development objectives, which sometimes are equal to the environment objectives, but sometimes may not be? So how do you deal with that potential conflict?
I think then, you know, going now further, obviously a lot of plans, but how is this really implementable? No? So we were talking here about the biodiversity plans, the NDCs. A lot of those targets and these ambitions are developed without actually thinking deeply what are the fiscal, the budget, the planning for scaling up investments. And as you were saying, development can be also having trade-offs, no? So we may be looking at expanding oil and gas on the other hand. So the question at the end is about how you look at this in terms of really a development pattern. There are good things. I think there is like, you know, some incentives that came out from the G20 as well. For example, the fact that Brazil, with the inspiration of G20, launched last week its country platform is a way to actually look at ways of mobilizing domestic, international, commercial, and concessional, looking at public and private, and trying to have a strategy to support nature-based solutions. But obviously, you know, on the critical side, there are still a lot of work to do. So to take some of the plans, Brazil is developing a plan now to enhance degraded land from pastures and to promote incentives to the agribusiness to actually do recover these degraded lands. But we need to ensure that these incentives are truly backed by, we were talking here today, transparency, real traceability, how we are going to ensure that this is really happening as part of the condition of the financing. No? So there are things that are like the devil in the details. Somebody was talking this morning about the moratorium on soya, so there could be backslashing as well on the policy side, and a good understanding also on how subsidies are being used need to be deeply understood. So there are, let's say, good ambitions, plans, and I think there is an understanding, which is good, increasingly in the economy, on how relying we are on nature. But we also often forget about, like on the benefit and return. Sometimes we want to have both, right? We want to benefit and we want also to get the return. So just to finalize another example that I find is a very interesting one, speaking about subsidies, we are having, without these dry seasons, huge problems with the agriculture production. And agriculture business now is pressuring the government to increase the subsidies embedded in insurance, because most of the agriculture insurance in Brazil is subsidized. Now, maybe because I have this finance background, when I was talking to the agribusiness in Brazil, I was saying, well, guys, no insurance is made to pay. And clearly you can't ask an insurance to increase coverage if the risk is not reduced. So the discussion needs to be more sophisticated also on the implementation when we talk about those things, to start thinking about, you want increased insurance, let's talk about how we reduce the risks, how doing good practices in terms of regenerative agriculture, restoration, etc., can be a way to have more coverage. And so indirectly, when we're talking about subsidies, a lot of the support that is given may not be only about the direct subsidies, but about this kind of incentives that we need to discuss also further.
It's really exciting to hear that you have an ecological transformation plan, and the bioeconomy is central to that, and the goals of course, transparency, traceability, equitability are all extremely important. So I think you've given us a lot of interesting examples of starting now, as the previous people suggested, with what we know, and we know the end point we want to get to. We're going to need to refine the roadmap along the way. So thank you for that. Let me turn to you, Mr. Granite. We know Sweden is among the countries that gives the highest proportion of its national income to overseas development assistance, or ODA. And you are now the director of CEDA. So how have Sweden used overseas development assistance to really incentivize the kind of policy reform we're talking about?
Thank you, Rosina. And this is a big question, and I think it's been addressed also during the day with these wonderful summaries that we heard. But for Sweden, of course, environment and climate and support to biodiversity has been very, very important from the outset. It's been really a part of our policies and programs in development assistance now for many, many years. But over the past 10 years here, we have realized, of course, that ODA financing is very limited, and it will not be enough in terms of meeting the challenges. And we can see the UN numbers of the need of $4,000 billion US per year to reach the SDG targets. Combined ODA is 200 billion, so it's a huge gap already there. And Swedish ODA, being large, it's still only about $6 billion US per day. So obviously, we need to look at how can we mobilize financing in a more at scale, in a more systematic way. So there are a couple of examples I think that are worth noting here. Since 2016, more or less, we have worked in Sweden with the investors community, the Investors for Sustainable Development. And that's really to bring along the pension funds, the commercial banks, all of them that have opportunities. And that has also then matured into the Global Investors for Sustainable Development framework, which combines a number of large financiers in the private sector space, now part of the UN. And discussion in these fora are very important, because on the one hand, to look at the need for investments to create opportunities for private sectors to thrive, but also to find the business opportunities, because these investors, they look for opportunities to invest. Rate of return might not have to be 10-50%, it could be lower if it's over time, over longer periods of time. So that's been a very important part, I think, of our work. And in parallel, we also work with the private sector in something we call the Sustainable Leaders Network, so bringing together all the 60,000 Swedish companies and trying to support them in identifying what is the business model here for investing into nature-based solutions or adaptation or the green climate transition. It's also been successful in Sweden, and that's turned into, over time, into the UN Global Compact. which then combines the larger private sector community globally for the same discussion. So these are two examples where we have really tried to bring together both private sector and the global investment community to try to find opportunities for business here. So, and then of course, as we heard in the summary here for Sweden in terms of on the policy arena, the whole of society approach was mentioned. I saw that in the screen here. And what does it mean? Well, for us in Sweden, it means not only bringing on board the different government authorities and the private sector and civil society in one approach. It also means bringing along everybody in this process. Even in Sweden, we can see that if you do not bring all citizens along in the green energy transition, you lose some of them. And then the discussion on subsidies for fossil fuel in transport sector grows, and that happened in our country. So it is really an important part of this to bring everybody along in this whole of society approach, in addition to what was mentioned here early on by in the summary. So these are a couple of examples, and then we work, of course, in different with partners in looking into with FAO on how to minimize subsidies for fisheries, for example, with the SMAP on the energy side, trying to look at the reducing subsidies in the energy sector and so forth. So that's more sort of practically. Thanks.
So you mentioned a couple of things that came up this morning. One that having some stability and long-term policy and funding is very important. And then you also said that overseas development assistance is not enough. So what advice would you give, since we have folks here from many other nations, what advice would you give to governments that are seeking policy reform, since the stability and policy common goal is important but may not be as easy to achieve in some of these other countries? Do you have advice for them?
Well, I think drawing on my own experience as heading one of our national agencies on marine and water management, I think starting at home is very important. So we need to have do our own homework in terms of addressing these topics, and also being an EU member, it is important for us to ensure that the policy frameworks that we are putting in place within the EU are also put in place within Sweden, and then become something which we can actually be proud of. So we are working, very closely together, of course, with countries like Ukraine. Now we are looking into becoming an EU member. So systematically, we are looking into the whole of EU acquis, trying to identify how can we support Ukraine then in this case to become an EU member. But if we do not have our own house in order, it won't be trustworthy. So we are working hard now, I think, in Sweden to try to identify these policies that are long-term and that sustain investment into these sectors. But I can say it's not easy. Political debates are polarized in Sweden and in Europe on these topics. The 30 by 30 goal set here in this convention, which is also then an EU goal, needs to be translated into Sweden, and we need to implement that in order to be trustworthy. So I think, on response to your question, it starts at home, and otherwise we won't be a reliable partner. Thank you.
Thank you. Very wise and very good to hear about all the proactive measures that you already have in place and that are being used by Sweden to make sure the ODA investments are working, with the whole of society and working with the banks to the greater goal. So now I think we will turn to you, Mr. Salazar, as the Executive Director of the Economic Commission on Latin America and the Caribbean. You have been very active in promoting the role of biodiversity in sustainable development in Latin America. And we heard from the breakout sessions and this morning how subsidies can be a challenge, but they can also be an opportunity. So be very interested in your comments on how biodiversity and a bioeconomy can be integrated into development pathways so that they are both nature and climate positive.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much. I'm afraid I'm going to speak in Spanish, so if you have need translation. Quisiera comenzar por agradecer muchísimo a Carmen Rodríguez, a todo el secretariado del GEF y felicitar a todas las instituciones que organizan este evento y saludar, por supuesto, a los colegas en el panel. Para hacer un primer punto importante, en nuestra visión desde CEPAL vemos a una América Latina y el Caribe sumida en tres trampas de desarrollo. La primera trampa es una de baja capacidad para crecer, pero baja capacidad para crecer es también baja capacidad para transformar. Y desde ese punto de vista estamos proponiendo la importancia fundamental de las políticas de desarrollo productivo que incluyen la necesidad de apostarle a ciertos sectores transformadores, ciertos sectores
sectors or
y dentro
driving
de estos una
sectors.
cantidad
And among
importante,
these,
por lo
a
menos una tercera
significant
parte,
amount,
la
at least
mitad de
a
ellos son
third
sectores
or half of them, are
estrictamente para el
sectors which
crecimiento
are
verde,
strictly
¿no?
for green
La
growth.
bioeconomía, el
Bioeconomy,
turismo sostenible,
sustainable
la
tourism,
transición energética, la
energy
economía
transition,
circular, la
circular
gestión
economy,
sostenible del
sustainable
agua,
management of water,
la agricultura
and
sostenible,
sustainable
etcétera.
agriculture,
Eso es parte de
etc.
todo un nuevo
Those are a
paradigma de
part of a new
crecimiento que
paradigm
no
of
es
growth,
crecimiento per se,
which is not
es
growth
crecimiento
per se,
transformador.
it's
Entonces,
transformative growth.
eso es el primer punto
So
que
that would
quisiera
be
hacer, que hay un
I wanted to
contexto más
present,
amplio de cómo
and there is a bigger context
pensamos en
on how
CEPAL
we are
que los
thinking
países de
in
América Latina y
CEPAL
Caribe
about the
deben
countries in Latin
enfocar el
America and
tema del
Caribbean,
crecimiento y
how
de la
they should
transformación
approach the topic
productiva.
of growth
Y por
and
supuesto
productive
que esa es una
transformation in their countries,
productiva
and of
para un
course that
crecimiento
productive
más
transformation for
inclusivo
a more
y
inclusive
sostenible,
growth and
no
more
es para hacer
sustainable
más de lo
growth
mismo.
is not just to do
Habiendo
more of
dicho
the
eso,
same.
entonces, para responder
Having
la
said
pregunta
that, and to
para
answer the
integrar
question directly, in order to
biodiversidad
integrate
y la economía
biodiversity and
en los modelos de
bioeconomy into
desarrollo
our development
de manera
models
viable, de
in
manera
a viable
respetuosa
and
con el ambiente,
respectful
etcétera,
with
que es la primera
nature,
pregunta.
which is the first question.
Queremos o quisiera compartir
I would
cinco
like to share
mensajes o cinco
5
lineamientos. Primero,
guidelines.
hay que hacer lo que se está haciendo
First,
en
we
este
have
escenario,
to do what
que
we're
es
doing here in this
reconocer y
scenario, which is
visibilizar el papel
recognizing
de
and
la,
making visible
biodiversidad
the
en la
role of
producción
biodiversity
y en el
in the
sustento de los
production
medios de vida.
and
Entre los datos y
sustainment
narrativas para
of
hacer
a
esto, y
livelihood
se
of
habló
people.
en una
Among the data that
presentaciones
narratives
antes
to
de
do
la importancia de
this,
los datos,
it's important
to
to
make the case.
remember,
Es importante
we
recordar,
talked
por
about it
ejemplo,
when we talked about making the case, it's
75%
important to remember that 75% of the
dependen
production
en alguna
of
medida de la polinización animal.
stocks depend
Y que la
on
región
some way of
representa el
animal
16%
pollination, and that the region
de las
represents the
exportaciones
16%
mundiales de
of
alimentos en
world
2022.
export of
Solo
food
para mencionar dos datos.
between 2020 and
Eso es un punto.
2022.
Lo segundo es que
That's first point.
es importante
Second,
apostar por
that it's that
acciones
important
innovadoras y
to bed for
transformativas,
innovative and
como
transformating
lo que hemos
actions
estado escuchando el día de hoy en
as
este
the
panel,
one that we have
buscando los
heard
patrones
in
de
this panel,
producción y de
which change the
consumo,
patterns of production and
impulsando sectores que
consumption,
contribuyen a la
driving or
regeneración
promoting
del
sectors
patrimonio
that
natural,
contribute to the
y también la
regeneration of
regulación y
natural
las reglas del juego en
patrimony,
línea
and
con
also
los
regulations
objetivos
and
climáticos del planeta.
ground rules
Por ejemplo,
which are aligned
es
with the
posible
climate
generar
objectives of the planet. For example,
electricidad
it is
con
possible to
residuos
generate electricity with
Países como Costa Rica y
agricultural
Brasil,
waste or
los meses
residues.
de baja
Countries
producción
like Costa Rica and Brazil, in
ahora
months
con
of
las
low
sequías y demás,
hydroelectric
cada vez,
production,
la hidroelectricidad
we
depende
know
de
that
la meteorología.
hydroelectricity always
Esto puede
depends on
mitigarse con
meteorology, and
energía
that can
proveniente de
mitigate it
residuos de
with
caña, de
energy
arroz,
coming
de
from
trigo o
the
ganado.
waste of
Tercero, es
sugarcane,
fundamental
rice,
instrumental
pineapple,
inversión y
and
financiamiento
livestock.
para la
Third, it is
biodiversidad,
key to
supliendo las
increase
carencias de los
investment in
mercados
financing for
financieros que no logran
biodiversity,
reconocer su valor ni sus
covering the
características
lacks or
allí,
the things that
bueno,
are
está todo
needed
el
in
tema de
those
la
sectors. We
naturaleza,
have, for
que ya lo
example,
hacen en
the
eventos,
topic
pero hay
of
que hacer
nature
eso
exchanges
muchísimo
and
más
nature
escala,
trades, and we
como
have to
sé
do
que
that
ustedes
in a
lo
bigger
deberían
scale,
saber
and we know
conversando
that
de esto.
during the day we have
cuarto
had this kind
punto
of
es actuar de
conversations.
manera integral,
Fourth is to
porque hay
act
una relación
in
muy
a
directa entre la
comprehensive way,
pérdida de
because there is a
biodiversidad y
very
el
strange,
cambio climático.
close
Estos son
relationship
temas
between the loss of
separados.
biodiversity and climate change. These are not unrelated topics. They have different COPs events, but they are very closely related. And fifth, to reinforce the capabilities and conditions which enable change, and that means to strengthen the capabilities of management for transition. We are not only working in this field, but all of the different gaps in the big transformation that we are talking about, and we're placing an emphasis on how. And the topic of how lands on 4 major areas. First, governance. First, institutional capacity of the different institutions, what we call top capabilities, technical, operational, political, and perspectives. And also spaces for social dialogue, which we have, which we heard from the recommendations. And also it touches another topic about the political economy for transformation. It is a big topic, but the topic of how is absolutely fundamental. So we are proposing these 5 areas of work, and this is what we developed in this document, Biodiversity and Development, which was precisely prepared for this COP. Thank you.
And it's a wonderful report. Thank you so
Thank you.
much. So, you know, I think the way you started is really important for us all to remember that, you know, low capacity for growth might mean low capacity for transformation. So then you need to be very innovative and choose green growth areas, which it sounds like you are doing. And of course, your guidelines are very excited to do it with inclusivity and governance, capacity building, et cetera. But could I ask you to comment on, given that there are harmful subsidies in general, how can they actually be reformed or then transformed into positive subsidies and policies that are pro-nature?
Sí, muchísimas gracias. Bueno, no les voy a, ustedes son expertos y conocen los datos de las enormes dimensiones de los subsidios explícitos e implícitos que existen.
Implicit and explicit subsidies which are already in place. They are huge numbers, and as Carlos Manuel and Jeff, you have been saying, if we are erasing with our left hand what we're doing with our right hand, does not work. So the topic of how to have the right incentives and how to align them, because economists know, and we know very well, people in corporations, multinationals, and investments, they respond to incentives. So that is a reality in our world. So it is important to align those incentives and eliminate the harmful incentives that we already have, according to our calculation, that can add up. If we add implicit and explicit, it might be 8% of the global GDP, which is an astounding number. So that reform needs to consider the social and economical implications, because subsidies originally were established and designed to contribute to national development objectives, such as security, energy, access, food security, poverty relief, and other objectives, which were very valid reasons in the economic logic in order to find those results. And then we have the topic of political economy, which was also touched on the recommendations. So this has to be articulated in order to promote productive transformation that supports environmental sustainability, but with our eyes well open to the resistance in the political environment and the alternatives that can be available in its place. Now, if those subsidies are well designed, they can have a net positive benefit for society and the planet. For example, government payments for activities related to conservation, or the topic of ecosystem services. In my country, in Costa Rica, those payments were used to stop deforestation and finance forestal recovery. The country went from having 21% to having 57% of the territory covered by forest from 1987 to 2023. Then we had a tax to fuel that upheld the program for a few years, and of course, that is the foundation on which the tourism industry has grown. And of course, Carlos Manuel has been one of the champions and the key actors in this transformation journey in Costa Rica. Another examples are fiscal credits or fiscal exemptions to buy specific type of goods, for example, electric vehicles, solar energy, or wind energy as well. Studies in CEPAL in electromobility show a very interesting opportunity to combine engineering from Chile. We have 2 companies in Chile that can transform diesel buses into electric buses, much more cheaply than Chinese buses, Brazilian industrial capacity, and also green funds in Costa Rica. So we could completely replace bus fleets which are operated with diesel by other types of fleets operated with electricity, which is something urgent to do. And there's also another conversation about how to fund these. In the case of the studies that we have conducted, it means to raise rates, interest rates from 18 to 20%. It's not that much, but we know that it's a sensitive topic, but there are other alternatives for financing as well. And in eliminating harmful subsidies, besides environmental benefits, and also in creating a bigger fiscal space for this, because we cannot forget that the cost of these subsidies is not that they are harmful for environmental objective, but also we are in a time of very limited fiscal space in this Latin American and Caribbean countries, and the Ministry of State are under a lot of pressure from their government if they are financing ODAs. We have some of the public investment rates, one of the lowest investment rates compared to other countries in the region. So we have the topic of political economy, and also we need to think about promoting activities and products that can replace or be alternatives to those beneficiaries of subsidies. The topic of having alternatives is key, because if we have alternatives, because we do have alternatives, and we were talking with Carlos and Miguel, the lead of sustainable development. In Europe, there are many, many alternatives. There is technology and infrastructure. In Latin America and the Caribbean, sometimes we don't have those many options, or they are much more expensive because we don't have the sustainable development that is in Europe. So those are just a few of the topics, and the summary is that we need to think about this in a comprehensive way, in an innovative way. And just to finish, I want to add that in order to move forward toward that policy coherence, from CIPAL we are insisting in what we call an approach of experimentalist governance and transformative governance, which is nothing different than governance based on dialogue, iterative processes, and including all of the different actors in wide processes and well-structured processes of social dialogue. So we circle back to the topic of hows, and voy a cambiar a inglés, cómo apoyar esta reforma de subsidios. El resumen que escuchamos del primer grupo me gustó mucho, y de esto es lo que hemos estado hablando en ECLACAM.
Subsidy reform, but on all areas, have a whole of society vision, have excellent data to make the case in front of the different ministries and so on, use what we have, the issue of political timing, which is crucial, and also, of course, the political economy, the winners and losers, and how to, that's the art of the politics, if you want. Thank you.
I think that was very wise of you to summarize in English. But I think you gave us a number of really interesting examples. I love the idea of an experiment with transformational governance and inclusivity. And so I think, as we've discussed, you certainly need governments to signal that these are the directions we want to go in. And we've heard a lot of commentary today that the private sector has momentum to move in these directions, and they need to work together. But there's not enough money, and it needs to be catalyzed. And so let's turn to Dr. Samper. As we discussed in the very opening plenary, the private sector really plays a critical role in any efforts to reform national policy landscapes and to really, I hope, effect transformational change. But there's not enough public financing, but an important and increasingly important part of private financing, I would argue, is the philanthropic community being truly catalytic and finding innovative pathways towards solving these seemingly intractable environmental problems. And I guess I would say few have more potential to positively impact change than the Bezos Earth Fund. So please tell us, how can you support policy reform?
All right, thanks, Eileen. It's great to be here with this panel today, and thank you for a really good day. I'm so happy we're having this on Target 18, because most attention is on Target 19. So I think this is really critical. Look, I think given the numbers that we've seen, and this is something we've been asking ourselves, these are billions and billions of dollars, and philanthropies, even as big as we are tiny compared to the size of the magnitude. And the question is, are there certain places where we could do some targeted investments. And I've actually today, I wasn't sure what to say, so I've been during the day talking to all the panelists and asking that question. And I'm going to share with you a little bit of what they heard. But let me say right up front that I think what makes the philanthropy different from bilateral aid and others sometimes is that we can probably move quite often faster. We can really move on a dime, and we can, in many cases, approve proposals in a matter of weeks or even days. We can be more innovative in some cases. We can take certain investments and things that sometimes the public system is not designed to do, and we're also willing to take risks. We're quite open to do failures and things, and certainly one of the things that I know our principal always tells us, sort of take some risk. If you're not failing, we're not trying hard enough, and I think it's a little bit easier. Now, the little informal poll I did during the day, I said I came up with 3 sets of issues for each positive incentives and harmful incentives. On the positive incentive side, I think the first one that came up many times is around the issue of research data and analytics. We do need to be able to measure this, clearly. We need the tools. The governments need to know what's happening in the territories, what's the impact of the policies, what's happening, and how do we do this. And I'll give you 2 examples of things that we're doing directly. One is we're at a point where we've got incredible technological tools that allow us to really track what's happening in some of these ecosystems. So one of the biggest investments that we have made is working with the World Resources Institute to take many of you know as the Global Forest Watch platform, which has been used extensively to monitor, look at rates of deforestation, fires, and so many issues at high resolutions. But we're now going to expand that to cover all terrestrial ecosystems. Cerrados, grasslands, wetlands, and so many others. And that's going to be launched next year, which I think will be another incredible data tool that's open and that people could use widely. And the second one is partnering with organizations closer to the ground to really do this kind of analysis. Matter of fact, with ICS, we partner with ICS, and we support ICS in the work about looking at the Amazon, specifically the Brazilian Amazon, and see which are the models, which are the economic development options here. What is the role of incentives in these issues? So we combine this data with the power of think tank like ICS and really being able to look at some of the analysis of some things Maria mentioned. So that's one. Second one is we do think we need to build capacity and do technical assistance, specifically around areas like payment for ecosystem services. I mean, even if there are some of these payments, ecosystem services may have great potential, but we need to be able to measure them. We need the people on the ground. We need the organizations that can really do this in a fast, efficient, and effective way. And I think that's an area where we can potentially make some targeted investments. Certainly something that we're building more and more to some of the areas, and we're exploring some ideas about how we can test this across a series of landscapes and potentially some seascapes as well. And the third issue, which actually Eileen mentioned in the breakout group, and I hope she'll mention it when she comes up here, was some philanthropies, probably not us, but some others, are in a position where they may be able to take on some of the guarantees. Because there are cases here where the private sector and the banks, we heard it a little while ago, are willing to make some investments, but there is a risk element here, and we need certain guarantees here. And there are mechanisms and innovative finance mechanisms where some philanthropy can take on that early risk in a way that we develop those pilots before to de-risk some of these potential investments. So I think those are 3 areas there. Harmful subsidies can be overwhelming in many ways, but the 3 top contenders in this that came up, one is, again, data analytics. We need to be able to measure this. If we're going to combat this, we know what the changes are, so that's no surprise. It's the same issue we discussed before. Second is the convening power. I mean, this is something important, but one thing we have learned at the Basel Surf Fund in the last few years since we started is we do have the ability to bring different stakeholders together, to partner with organizations at events like this, and to really bring different kinds of stakeholders to the table to really be able to have serious conversation about this and to share lessons. And that's an important issue. And that brings me to the last point here, which is around really looking at different practices, success cases, failures, and others, and really sharing that across countries and geographies and really being able to scale that up. I think that's something really important. So for example, just to give you something we're looking at is we partnered with TNC actually and many other players to look at the issue of cattle in the state of Pará in Brazil. State of Pará has 26 million head of cattle. which is quite remarkable. It's, we know that it's been linked to deforestation extensively, a lot of that with the wrong kind of subsidies, harmful subsidies behind that. But the whole issue around cattle traceability is a critical issue, and look at which are the incentives. So it's a partnership between the government, companies like JBS, NGOs like TNC, and many other players in this landscape to really figure out how we can fundamentally identify these issues, introduce technological innovations, and really be able to identify and redirect some of these subsidies so we can actually trace this and eventually reduce the footprint of things like cattle. So I think these are just a few of the examples that we're looking at, but we're open to ideas. And again, just to finish, we think the scale of our resources is modest compared to the size of this, but we do think there may be certain catalytic investments that we would be able to do, and we're happy and willing to do that, and to partner with some of the other organizations that are here in this panel.
Well, being able to be fast is very important, and that's something governments are known to do. And being able to take risk is also something that many of the multilaterals have trouble with. So I think both of those things really can be quite catalytic. And boy, do we need the lessons learned from all the efforts that have been put together by all the organizations out here. So that's really incredible. Do you want to mention any other particular project that is very high risk, for example? I mean, all these things that you mentioned are really needed, but what is kind of a high risk project that failure could occur, but if it's successful, it would be potentially transformational?
Well, actually, we just issued recently a call for looking at the issues of the use of artificial intelligence for nature and climate. It's an interesting example. We can really use new technologies to explore totally transforming the way we're analyzing data. We're at a point right now where we have so much data, and yet we don't have the capacity to be able to analyze a lot of this and to really look for different patterns and things. So we issued this. We had a tremendous response, focusing on issues like biodiversity conservation, but also alternative proteins and other sources. So we really look at the use of new technologies that are emerging and really trying to partner mostly with academic institutions, but also NGOs and other companies to really look at how we can do it. It's a good example where we recognize a lot of those efforts will probably fail, and yet we think this is the moment to invest.
It's wonderful, very exciting for all the academics who want to try these things. So we are going into overtime, but could I just give maybe each of you 1 minute or less to mention either the most important thing you heard today or something you didn't hear today that you wish you heard, or just one parting thought you want to leave with us? And maybe we'll start with Minister Salazar.
Thank you very much. Well, I am at a disadvantage because I only came at 4 o'clock. but what I've heard now, well, many things. I think all this importance of data and analytics and research, also because that's very much what we do at ECLAC. We're already talking with Carlos Manuel and so on being able to do, some mapping and of subsidies and then classifying them and categorizing, understanding the economics of it and so on. So I think that's an area that we'll be very, very happy to partner with the GEF and with any of you. And this is, we have quite an analytical capacity in ECLAC on a number of areas, but including general equilibrium models and other sophisticated techniques for this kind of research. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And we'll just go down the line, Jacob, if you want to go next.
Thank you, Rosina. I want to pick up on the minister's point on political economy also, because what we clearly see here is that every geography is very different. I mean, we can do experiment and tests and AI and so forth, but unless we drill down to the real situation, it will be difficult. And our approach now as a bilateral agency is really to work in depth in country to understand the political economy and the investment opportunity as a bilateral agency in the landscape of financing you have and in relationship to what type of investments you would like to work on. You mentioned a few on the green energy transition and so forth. This will, I think, be different, and the tools we now have as a bilateral aid agency are guarantees. For example, we are working with the Inter-American Development Bank to do financing for the Amazon Forever program. So $200 million of a guarantee from Sweden raise about $800 million for investments into public investment opportunities in nature-based solutions and so forth throughout Amazon. So why do I say that? I think, well, because the whole point of this is somehow, I think, to get the private sector and our ordinary classic type of market investments on board. That would be important. Innovation and working, yes, that's fine, we need that, but we also just need to get them on board and find stability to come and invest with us. Thank you.
So what I heard that was really shocking to me today was something that was not mentioned in the plenary, but I heard from some people here during coffee break, and it was a real eye-opener for me, which is the growth in harmful environmental subsidies in the last 2 years since the framework was adopted. And the figure that was quoted, which I don't know if it's true or not, and we'd have to check it, is that in the last 2 years alone, that value may have increased by $800 billion. If that is true, that is more than the entire Target 19. It makes me wonder whether Target 19 is right and whether we're actually being ambitious enough. Because if we're growing at this rate and we're ambitious only to remove 500 billion, we're falling short and we're falling behind.
And Maria, we'll give you the last word.
Okay, I actually, from the closing remarks, I took 3 words that I think are interesting: landscape approach, toolkits, and economic valuation. So the landscape approach, I think, is very important and is a good, summarization of the conversation today, that we can't just look at the incentives only looking at part of the problem, not only biodiversity and climate, but the whole value chain, right? So if you give the incentives up or just down, you don't resolve the whole value chain and the transformation. And I think this is a very important topic when we are talking about incentives, to understand actually the whole value chain. The second is the toolkit. Is probably not just one measure is the best for everything. We need to have tailored approaches, and this means probably a blend of different solutions. And sometimes the credit, sometimes the incentives with payments for environmental service. Sometimes the way to do that is also policy incentives, and probably is a package of that, but that has to be well managed and structured, no? And the economic valuation, I think, is, for me, the most transformational thing we need to start bringing to discussion. We are at a moment, and now maybe because of my climate background, that we are going to a 3-degree scenario. And that means economically a huge challenge for the humanity. But the same happens with the nature, okay? And the question really is, we can't anymore plan investments, fiscal management, the way we were doing budgets, as we used, only looking at historical data. So my provocation, it is about data, but it's also about how we work with uncertainty and scenarios that are very, very different from what we have historically. This is what today insurances are having as a problem. Rating agencies, nations like Colombia, when it tried to do its sustainable bond and was downgraded because was considered that, well, they said they're phasing out oil, so where is the financial return? We'll have to start having a conversation about how we are looking at the even financial modeling, fiscal modeling, integrating these risks, because they are real. And I think this, for me, is the biggest challenge when we talk about here, is that the incentives are not only needed, they are actually part of the way we have to rethink our economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's thank this amazing panel. All right, and as they leave the stage, thank you so much. You know, we could go on for many hours, but time flies and the reception awaits us. We've had really incredibly productive, important discussions. We've made many connections across all of you from our day of conversation. So now, for our final wrap-up, it is my pleasure to invite Eileen Lee, who is the Chief of Programs at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, to offer her grand summary of the day, and that will be followed by a conversation with the Jeff CEO, Carlos Manuel Rodriguez. So let's welcome both Eileen and Carlos Manuel to the stage. And
Can you hear me? Okay, great. First of all, thank you, Carlos Manuel and the Jeff, for hosting this amazing gathering. I have to admit that when I was telling a colleague that I was spending my entire day today talking about Target 18 and subsidies, they said, "Why would you want to do that? We've had that conversation so many times and nothing ever changes." And for me, what's been so positive is this conversation feels different. The momentum feels different. The willingness to dig in feels different. It feels possible, and that alone is exciting. I have to admit, though, the task of trying to summarize this entire session feels a little bit like a metaphor for this whole problem, in the sense that it feels like it's about understanding this problem in all its complexity, and yet being able to find those couple of strands of hope and, frankly, some forward momentum and next steps that we can take through this. I really appreciated and took great confidence in the morning from, I think, the recognition that we can step into this tension of, on the one hand, really understanding that, as Barry Gardner so passionately reminded us, that it should be startlingly obvious that this needs to change. I think he said that if we could be normal, sensible human beings, we should be able to move this forward. And yet at the same time, I think it was also important for us to look honestly at the trade-offs and the realities that this isn't easy, and that the reason it's intractable is because there are vulnerable communities, people that are invested, and a lot of things that have to be very carefully managed if we're going to make this transition successful. The good news, I think we heard in a lot of the breakout sessions, that we know how to do this. We know how to get the incentives moving in the right direction. There were some great examples of both private sector and multi-sector action in that direction. But I think the bad news is that getting the core subsidies, that kind of core problem, the leaking in the bathtub that we talked about this morning, or frankly, the sense that we're in a hole, so maybe we can't dig our way out of it. We're gonna have to stop digging if we wanna get it better. That it's fundamentally a systems change problem. So how do you attack a systems change problem? You have to understand the system. You have to really look at the needs of all the stakeholders in the systems and solve them, and you have to pull the pieces together. So I think when we heard lots of great examples of all of those things through the day. In terms of understanding the system, I think we heard, loud and clear from really every sector represented, the importance of the data and information and understanding of nature risk and benefits that we can bring to it. And I think excitingly, we also heard about a lot of the breakthroughs and innovations that are happening that should allow us to fundamentally address those things in very different ways than we have before. On the front of solving for the needs of those that are invested in the system, I think Valerie Hickey made a very important intervention in reminding us that we don't really have all the right people at the table for the conversation today. That if we want to do this, this is ultimately first and foremost about centering those who are most vulnerable, who stand to live the most with the consequences, both of the damage that we're doing to the planet, but also to the economic harms that we're trying to avoid as we manage for a transition. And bringing that front and center seemed like the most important way to root this work differently. We also heard about solving for the needs of the governments and the government champions and leaders who are carrying this forward, right? That we have in our community many ministers of the environment who are doing their best to shoulder the load. That's not enough. Bringing this to a whole of government issue, and I think maybe even more importantly, a whole of society issue, feels fundamentally important. And I was actually thinking, as I was hearing people talk about what it's going to take to move this, that maybe one of the biggest pieces of inspiration this week is the green zone right outside here, right? Because if I think about the opportunity that Colombia has before it to shift within its system, and the people who are out there today sort of coming to take pride in their country's biodiversity, it's an amazing thing, and it's probably underlying the kind of shift that we're ultimately going to need. And if anybody hasn't had a chance to pop in, just go out and talk to some of the people who are there. They are just excited to be hosting COP. And then finally, for businesses. I think we heard a lot of business people say that they are ready to innovate, that business will move with the incentives, and that they can be advocates and partners for the kind of level playing field that can make a difference. And I think we also heard that understanding the risks is really important, but also finding ways to move from that risk to opportunity is going to be essential. And then finally, I think once you add all these things together, thinking about how at a landscape or country scale, we can start to pull these threads and drive that systems change. And I think the daunting thing about systems change is that systems are so sticky. The amazing thing about systems change is once it starts moving, it has that positive feedback and dynamic of its own. So I think that, to me, is really the task before us today. But now I get to turn in conversation to Carlos Manuel, who I think gets credit for bringing this community together. And I'm going to paraphrase Valerie. I think she talked about moving from a coalition of the willing to a coalition of the working. And I think you really are leading the charge, and I think bringing that community and coalition together. I guess the first thing maybe that I'd love to hear your reflections on is, as a number of people reminded us, the outputs of this session are a great opportunity to drive some key messages home to the negotiators that will be working on Target 18 in the next couple of days. Based on what you've heard, what do you think are some of the most important messages for them to take away about Target 18 implementation and transition?
Thanks, Eileen. And let me begin by your very first question on why we're here. We are here because in October 2010, in Nagoya, as a Costa Rican negotiator, I was working with Lina Barrera, and we were defining the Aichi targets. And based on my work in Costa Rica, I was kind of putting a lot of emphasis that we need to put a target in the Aichi target that can take us from negative and perverse incentives into positive ones. Diksha, can you put the slide, please? And I presented in October 2010 this slide to the negotiators. So this is the graph of Costa Rica. I made this in 2009. The deforestation rate in Costa Rica, and there you see how the line of deforestation went from 60,000 hectares a year almost to none, and which were the political decisions that were taken to revert the rate of deforestation. And just in Costa Rica, people tend to believe that the payment for environmental services, creating that positive incentive, was what drive the change in land use and deforestation. No, it was not. Look at that. It says elimination of perverse incentives, and that was 2010. So I've been working on this idea since 2010. I was the little rock in the shoe of the negotiators where I was pushing and pushing for a target on perverse incentives. Unfortunately, and then I work on the indicators. Unfortunately, we were not ready for addressing this at the highest political level, and it has taken us a decade to be here. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to have this community of people really believing that policy coherence is by far the largest challenges, not just in sustainability and protecting the nature, is in the best interest of human well-being. And we, even though we know the data and the evidence, we still have a political system that is not rational. And why the political system is not rational? Because of the way we have structured, particularly how we have structured the executive branch. And in concrete, on how governments through the executive branch tend to believe that they will achieve their sustainability objectives with many agencies managing natural and renewable and non-renewable natural resources with many different ideas and impressions. And that is why today we talk about NDCs and NBSAPs, and the Minister of Agriculture doesn't know what an NBSAP is, and the Minister of Energy doesn't know what an NDC is all about. Seriously, they don't know what it is. By the way, behind the line of elimination of perverse incentives, there's another very important political decision that we took in Costa Rica that really helped accelerate curbing down the rate of deforestation, which is what I call there environmental governance improve. That means that in Costa Rica, we don't manage natural resources in the executive branch through many different agencies. When I was the Minister of Environment, I was also the Minister of Energy, Mining, Water, the Oceans, and Nature. I never had to fight with a Minister of Energy at all, never. My problem was definitely the Minister of Agriculture. So I asked myself, Eileen, what is the difference between the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Agriculture? I mean, both of them work with biodiversity, one with domesticated biodiversity, the other with wild biodiversity, in the same landscapes with the same stakeholders. Why? Well, we learned that we need agencies that work at the landscape level. So dealing with the two big challenges that promotes political incoherence, one is the market failure and another the institutional failure, has got to this point. So I believe that today many different things were relevant and important. First is having this like-minded group of people from very different sides of the spectrum. The challenge needs everyone understanding what is their role and what they should do. And at the end of the day, what we have is a major political challenge. And don't believe that the political challenge is convincing the Minister of Finance and the President. No, no, no. It's taking things to national congresses and parliaments, because this is where the ultimate challenge is. And this is why the JEF, looking into the future, really believes in changing our JEF model into a whole of a government, whole of a society approach, which, and in another opportunity, I can explain about that.
No time like the present. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the things that Jeff is already doing to move in the direction of supporting Target 18 implementation, both the innovation window and...
Well, in Jeff 8, you know, coming out of the pandemic and being very new to the Jeff, I made my case when I was in the selection process of the Jeff, and I said, you know, I know the Jeff better than any one of these candidates, but to be frank, I didn't know much. It was a learning process to me. But from the early days, my early days at the JEP 4 years ago, I began saying the way that we can narrow the domestic and the global financial gap is addressing the lack of political coherence at the country level. And that was basically what I said. I'm very fortunate to have at the JEP Secretariat such a strong group of brilliant people who began helping me giving shape. And then we were able to present some ideas to countries in the 8th replenishment. And one of the big challenges, politically speaking, was countries telling us at the JEP Secretariat, you shouldn't mess with domestic policies. We are sovereign. The JEP is a secretariat that should be doing what we should be telling them to do, so it was very difficult. So we created a couple of opportunities, like it was explained by Claude early this morning, a policy coherence window, where we, set aside a little bit of the resources for the largest JEF recipient countries and promote a competition within themselves on projects that address this issue. So I think, Eileen, that the pill is already in the tongue of the countries. Now we need to push it, it goes down, and then in JEF 9, we can do a really structural, comprehensive approach in what those means the JEF working in policy coherence. And just let me give you a very quick preview. What does this mean? This means a new business model for the JEF. We at the JEF, we say that we work with countries, but that is not true. We don't work with countries. We work just with the executive branch. But then that is not even true. We don't work with the Minister of Finance. We don't work with the Minister of Agriculture. We work with ministers of environment. This is what we've been doing for years. And yes, we do a lot of good things, but we don't move the needle. Or we move it very little. So little that we don't even see it. So we need to go from having operational focal points in the Ministries of Environment to steering committees like the way that Mexico has organized, like the way that Brazil has organized. Mexico and Brazil are two countries that have finance, environment, and other key institutions from the executive branch that decide on how to use their resources. For me, it was a great surprise to go to Mexico and go to the Ministry of Agriculture with the Minister of Agriculture launching a JEF project, and I was looking for the Minister of Environment, and he was not in the room. And I was very happy to see that. So this is what we want. We want a steering committee that really brings the national development priorities and the NDCs and NBSAPs and the other plans across the executive branch. And this is a great opportunity for the ministries of environment to be positioned where they are not positioned right now. So the ministers of environment shouldn't see this as a threat to their JEF establishment, rather than an opportunity to grow and expand in his need to influence other decision makers. But that's just the beginning. We need to go at the subnational level. It is a moral imperative to go at the subnational level in a direct manner, working with governors and mayors. It's going to be super challenging because the political establishment in the JEF has this structure of an endorsement letter. The endorsement letter, it is a technical tool, but it's a political tool to control people. I used to be the political focal point of the JEF. And I remember once the Minister of Planning, the Minister of Planning, a young lady, very bright, one day she came to me and said, Carlos Manuel, you know what? I should be the political focal point of the JEF. And I said, oh my goodness, she is totally correct, but I'm not going to allow that. And I didn't allow that to happen. But since I'm not a minister anymore and I'm, guiding the JEF, I push for that. So we need to go at the subnational level. So the endorsement is something that we need to define. It's complex, it's politically sensitive, but the crisis out there is so serious that everything should be considered. So I won't be defending any political establishment. And then the third element on this whole of the government approach that we're thinking for JEF 9 has to do with the fact that, okay, we got the president, we got the Minister of Finance, we got the Minister of Energy on board, we are done. The subsidies will disappear, the incentives will phase out. No, wait a minute. I mean, you need to go to Congresses because you need to change those policies. They cannot be changed just with the will of someone in the executive branch. So we believe that there's a niche, a role for the JEF to work in the interface of the executive branch and national congresses. Sometimes he's supporting the executive branch, sometimes he's supporting Barry and all his friends around the huge global networks. Sometimes he's working with civil society that do policy advocacy at the governments. So that is what we're looking in terms of the whole of the government approach. And then there's the other element, because in JEF 9, we will present ideas on how the JEF should collaborate. And when I say the JEF collaborate, I mean putting money. because this is the business of the Jeff. So when I say collaborate, it's putting money. Collaborate with civil society. I challenged the Jeff Assembly a year ago, and I proposed them that by 2030, 10% of the JEP budget should go directly, and let's have that discussion what directly means, to indigenous people, local communities, youth, and women who works in the conventions that the JEF operates as the financial mechanisms. So in a nutshell, these are a little bit of the ideas for the future.
So we've heard today from many partners in government, in the private sector, in civil society, who are all eager, I think, to work with you on this agenda. What do you need from all of us? Are there things you would ask of those groups that are here?
Oh, what a tough question. I think that we need to, well, out of this conference and out of this process, the Jeff will be working on a publication. And that publication is a live, interactive document or process that should be feeding the replenishment of the Jeff. We will begin with the technical advisory group in February of next year, and with that, we will trigger a process where we will have much of a better understanding of the ABC on how to deal with this issue. I will say that in a very simplistic manner, based on what we work in Costa Rica, first mapping all of them. I mean, we don't have a clue. Then as you map them, you will divide them, which of those incentives, policies can be changed in the executive branch, and which of them needs a congressional decisions. And then you begin picking your fights. Then the third element is assessing the effectiveness of those incentives. And by the way, I went through something very interesting. You see the first, let's go back. Yes. You see the first one, it says the first forest incentives. In 1979, Costa Rica established the first forest incentives. When the structural adjustment plan with the World Bank was happening in the mid-1990s, the Minister of Finance in Costa Rica said, no more forest incentives. And I was, what? We're doing a lot of progress with those incentives. You know, we've been using taxpayers' money to this is what I call the first generation of forest incentives in Costa Rica. Second generation is payment for environmental services. In the first generation, you use taxpayers' money and you use the support of the Minister of Finance. In the second generation, you internalize a positive externality in a public service. So I want to defend the allocation of resources of those forest incentives in 1995, 1996 with the Minister of Finance, and I was caught off guard when the Minister of Finance said, Carlos Manuel, we have a commitment with the World Bank in terms of their structural adjustment plans, and no incentives will continue. And I was telling him, no, we're doing a lot of progress, deforestation is going down, we're integrating the industry with the forest, the farmers, and a lot of good stories, but I was not speaking his language. He showed me, he said, we have already invested $90 million in these forest incentives since 1979, and I don't see nothing in the GDP in terms of the contribution of the forest sector. And I was speechless. And that was the end of the first generation of forest incentives, which forced us, Costa Ricans, to think out of the box. And we came with this great idea of the payment for environmental services, put a tax on fossil fuels, was the first country. We did a tropical carbon tax, this is what we call it, and the rest is history. But my point is that you need to really study and measure the impact in a holistic manner. And then you began pushing for that economic information in those groups, private and public sector, that really understands. And it's very important, those high level officials in the Ministry of Finance. This is what we did. We came with information about the economic irrationality behind this, and began pushing and pushing. And then we did a lot of, when we finished with all the transformation that we were able to do in the executive branch, we jumped into Congress. And we began doing what, you normally do in a Congress. You put the small words here and there in that law, nobody knows about it, nobody jumps against it and push it and push it. So we did 3 reforms of the forest code, and in each one, there were small letters here and there, and we're pushing and pushing. Yes, there were big subsidies and incentives impossible to transform. For example, we really aim for changing the subsidy on fuel for the fishing sector. I mean, we are subsidizing one of the most irrational activities, and it was impossible. We did the economic case, we brought the local politician, and still there. So it is a learning by doing process, and I think that we need to, come around with some very basic approaches that we need to do all together, which will be, I would say, relatively similar. Policy reform doesn't happen in 2 or 3 years. Policy reform happens in a decade. So let's go for it. This is the right moment to go for it. Don't fear. The benefits are going to be way higher to those political costs. And the good news is that in a decade, the global leaders will be very different to the ones that we have today. Global leaders, the mean average of global leaders is my age, 64. I believe that the next generation of global leaders will facilitate this and many other changes.
I love that the message, the message of this is so important that we have to be able to take some swings where we'll miss, right? That some things will work, some won't, but we're playing the long game here, and we can continue to make progress. But I guess as we close out this session, Carlos Manuel, you have so much, I think, depth of experience with this, as you've told us some of the specific things that you've done in the trenches on this, but leave us with a story that gives us hope about how we move forward from here.
I'm used to tell stories about how complicated things are. I will say that, what really, really gives me hope is the fact that nowadays, you don't need to be a biologist to save the world. I mean, when I was having my kids, thinking that one, I hope that one is a biologist, and that other one is a forester, and that other one is this and the other, and I had a psychologist and a business administrator, but they are more committed than myself in terms of sustainability. Regardless of what your academic background or what is your vocation, those who are under 35, which are going to be the game changers, are going to help us from every single corner of society. So we need to hold on in there as much as we can. We need to do these kind of investments because these people are going to come with a lot of commitment and passion because they understand what we never understood, which is that their future is compromised by what we have done in terms of our irrational consumption and production system. Thank you. Well, thank you, Eileen. It's been a very, very long day. We've been working on this for almost a year, and there are more than 30 people that has contributed for a very, very successful conference. I want to thank each one of them. I cannot go through the whole list of people, but I feel very proud about the work that we all together has done. Here, the challenge is very clear. We need to commit to the process, and the Jeff will be leading in the effort to come up with a blueprint and help us move the needle in terms of the political willness within the JEF partnership, so we can do those leap forward in terms of more integrated approaches and be able to really contribute in the need for more political coherence at the country level. So thank you all and have a good day.